You're listening to Ecto Portal, a journey into the unknown with Anthony Anderson and Verna Wilson.
I hope that you are seated comfortably, with the light turned down and the curtains drawn.
Hello, and welcome once again to another journey into the unexplored, the unexplained Ecto Portal. I'm Anthony Anderson, your host, and I'm here with my co-host,
Verna Wilson.
And we have actually an interesting show this week, don't we, Verna?
Yeah, if you lived back in the 1800s in a small town, guess what? Your town could have been cursed.
Really?
Yeah, you're going to find out why.
Excellent.
Yeah.
All right, let's dig right into it.
Right. Okay.
Another story about voodoo, so it could be interesting.
Yeah. Okay. Well, the Manchac wetlands, it's about a half an hour northwest of New Orleans. It's thick with swamp ooze, and in the summer, the water is pea green. It's covered in tiny leaves and crawling with insects that hide in the shadows of the gray cypress trees. And there's boaters who enter the swamps. They face two main threats there, aside from sunstroke and dehydration. There's alligators who mostly lurk just out of view, and the broken logs that float through the swamp. It's a remnant of the days when the swamp was home to the abandoned logging town of Ruddock. I think that's what it's called. Mm-hmm. But some say that anyone entering the swamp should beware of a more supernatural threat, and that's the curse of local voodoo queen Julia Brown. Brown was sometimes called Julie White or Julia Black, and she's described in local legend as a voodoo priestess who lived at the edge of the swamp, and she worked with residents of the town of Frenier. That's how you pronounce
Frenier?
it. Frenier, yes, sorry about that. She was known for her charms and her curses, as well as singing eerie songs with her guitar on her porch. And one of the most memorable and disturbing songs went, "One day I'm going to die and take the whole town with me."
Interesting. Now, back when Brown was alive at the turn of the 20th century, the towns of Ruddock, Frenier, and Napton were prosperous settlements clustered on the edge of Lake Pontchartrain. Sustained by logging the centuries-old cypress trees and farming cabbages in the thick black soil. The railroad was the town's lifeline, bringing groceries from New Orleans and hauling away the logs and cabbages as far as Chicago. Now, they had no roads, no doctors, and no electricity, but they managed to carve out a cohesive and self-reliant community. Now, that all changed on September 29th in 1915, when a massive hurricane swept in from the Caribbean. In Frenier, where Julia lived, the storm surge rose 13 feet and the winds howled at 125 miles an hour. Many of the townsfolk sought refuge in the railroad depot, which collapsed and killed 25 people. Altogether, close to 300 people in Louisiana died, with almost 60 in Frenier and Ruddock alone. Now, when the storm cleared on October 1st, Frenier, Ruddock, and Napton had been entirely destroyed, homes flattened, buildings demolished, and miles of railway tracks washed away. One of the few survivors later described how he'd clung to an upturned cypress tree and shut his ears against the screams of those that were drowning in the swamp.
Now, the hurricane, it seemed to come out of nowhere. If you listen to the guides who take tourists into the Manchac swamp, the storm was the result of the wrath of Julia Brown. Brown, they say, laid a curse on the town because she felt taken for granted. A curse that came true when the storm swept through on the day of her funeral and killed everyone around her. On certain tours, the guides take people past a rundown swamp graveyard marked 1915. It's a prop, but it's a good place to tell people that Brown's ghost still haunts the swamp, as do the souls of those who perished in the hurricane. The legend of Julia Brown has become the area's most popular ghost story, spreading to paranormal shows and even Reddit, where some claim to have seen Brown cackling at the edge of the water. And the author who wrote this article visited the swamp earlier last year, and he heard Julia Brown's story. He said that he got curious separating fact from fiction. It turns out that she was a real person, and the census records suggest that she was born Julia Bernard in Louisiana around 1845, and then she married a laborer named Celestin Brown in 1880. So about 20 years later, the federal government gave her husband a 40-acre homestead plot to farm, property that likely passed on to Julia after her husband's death around 1914. Now, official census and property records don't make any mention of her voodoo work, but that's not surprising. A modern New Orleans voodoo priestess, Bloody Mary, told Mental Floss, which was who are the people who are doing this article, that she found references to a voodoo priestess or queen by the name of Brown who worked in New Orleans around the 1860s before moving out to Frenier. And Mary notes that because the towns had no doctors, Brown likely served as a local healer and midwife, using whatever knowledge and materials that she would find to care for the local residents.
Now, Brown's song is documented too. An oral history account from the longtime area resident Helen Slosser Berg records that Aunt Julia Brown always sat on her front porch and played her guitar and sang songs that she would make up. The words to one of the songs she sang that one day she would die and everything would die with her. Now, there's even one newspaper account from 1915 that describes Brown's funeral on the day of the storm. In the words of the New Orleans Times-Picayune from October 2, 1915, warning, there's offensive language coming up, many pranks were played by wind and tide. Negroes had gathered for miles to attend the funeral of Aunt Julia Brown, an old negress who was well known in that section and was a big property owner. The funeral was scheduled, and Aunt Julia had been placed in her casket, and the casket in turn had been placed in the customary wooden box and sealed. Now at 4 o'clock, however, the storm became so violent that the Negroes left the house in a stampede, abandoning the corpse. The corpse was found Thursday, and so was the wooden box, but the casket was never found.
Bloody Mary, however, doesn't think that Brown laid any kind of curse on the town. Voodoo isn't as much about curses as it is about healing, she said. The locals she's spoken to remember Julia as a beloved local healer, not a revengeful type. In fact, Mary suggests that Julia's song may have been more warning to the townspeople than a curse against them. And perhaps Brown even tried to perform an anti-storm ritual and was unable to stop the hurricane before it was too late. Whatever she did, Mary says, it wasn't out of revenge, and if she's still in the swamp, you have less to fear from her than from the alligators. So, and I believe that this was, they talked to her back in actually 2016 about Mary, the other voodoo priestess.
So literally it was like 100 years later.
Yeah.
That in fact, this article is probably written because of that, is my guess. It's interesting that it could have been, I mean, yes, there's voodoo curses. Voodoo priestesses do have curses, but they also are well aware that when you curse someone, it will come back to haunt you. That's how curses work.
Yeah.
So they're very leery about cursing people for that reason.
Right.
You can use different voodoo spells to do certain things, but I know cursing people is not always...
They don't take it lightly.
No, that's not something you want to do. I don't even think most of them even suggest ever doing it, but it can be done. Now, whether this Julia Brown did this, I got the impression she's more like she's recorded folk song, or not recorded, but composed folk songs. She was a healer, who lived in the swamp or on this property. And I think it was probably one of her songs, one of her verses, and people just took it, oh my God, our town was destroyed. It must be that voodoo
They took her
queen.
more seriously than she took herself, maybe.
Yeah, it's almost like the witch hunt. Oh my God, look at all this horrible devastation happened to us. It must be that unusual loner woman, crazy healer, witch voodoo priestess who lives in the swamp.
Yeah.
You need somebody to blame, to blame.
And you think about the times, too. It was a small town, no doctors, no electricity. People lived on folklore, and they were very superstitious people back then. But what gets to me about Julia, and this is what I wondered about her, why would she sing something like that if there wasn't a little bit of anger in her?
Well,
I mean, she could have meant it as a joke, but there had to have been anger to sing something like that.
anger could have been irony, like, she knows that they don't like her much. Like I said, it could just be part of her song that those people just took as gospel, quote unquote, and took it to heart.
Well, it made me wonder how she was treated. She could have been, if people wanted something, that's when they came to her. Was she treated like garbage otherwise?
Yeah, like what is the backstory? Like, did people, like you said, treat her like a witch, treat her like a voodoo witch doctor, and shunned her? But the fact that her husband had so much property awarded to him by the government, and she had a sizable property, so she obviously couldn't have been too poor.
So she was respected, probably, in that way.
Maybe they resented her for that because she was a widow and she had all this property.
For sure.
Why should this woman have, this old crazy voodoo priestess woman, have all this property to herself?
And we're a poor community who hardly has anything, so they probably think she bewitched. That's why she has it.
Exactly. Not that that's a reason to ever do anything or think bad of anybody.
No, but people are people.
Yes, people are people, and they're ignorant as hell too sometimes.
Right.
As we found in many cases, many stories. I don't know. There isn't much information about her voodoo practicing, though, at all. At least in this article there isn't. I don't know if there is any other references to that.
When you talk about a small town near a swamp, it's a small, out-of-the-way town. It's different than living in a larger town like New Orleans, where there's all kinds, and it's a little bit more, in its own way, cosmopolitan.
Yeah, exactly.
I have a friend who was raised in a small town near the bayous. And although it was the 20th century when he was raised there, he said that people were very superstitious about things.
They still are.
They still are, yeah. And it was very small town mentality where it was very clannish. And people didn't like anybody who seemed different or who seemed strange, and they were weirded out by them. So even if you were a local and they knew you, if you seemed different or strange, people are going to treat you differently. And this happened in the 20th century where he was raised. So I could imagine back then, somebody like her, I mean, obviously, her and her husband were respected property owners, but being a voodoo priestess, a voodoo queen, you would have been known as a little different than the rest of them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was just thinking, as you were saying that, how, and he said he came from, obviously I think it was in the Bible Belt too, isn't it?
Yeah, right.
Now if you think about it, the Bible Belt, the middle of the country, and I noticed more of the fringe cities, New York, along the east and west coast, that you see a lot more different people from different countries, different places, customs, cultures, practices, different ways of looking at things, different opinions on things. And you see these barrage of these kinds of different people so much that it's normal for you to see people who are different, who act different, who talk different, who do things differently. But you get over it real fast. You realize they're not doing anything to me.
Sure.
So you might find some of it interesting. You might learn stuff. But I noticed if you go towards the middle of the country, you're not going to have those people coming from Europe, people coming from Japan, people coming from different parts of the world, because you're in the middle of the United States. So you're kind of in this bubble where you're not going to get the same interactions to all these people coming from other countries. Back then. Back now, it's not as much as it used to be. But I would imagine back then, if you have your God-fearing community and this voodoo priestess woman and brings it to New Orleans from outside, it's going to freak people out. They're going to think it's different. I mean, I know New Orleans, obviously the French were there first, so the culture's already there. The Haitians were there.
Right.
But the superstitions are going to be there. So, and I think there's still some of that in the country today in the middle. They still only see what they watch on TV, what they read in the newspaper, and that's it, what they know from each other. And if they don't go anywhere, and all they have is what this connection to the outside world from TV and newspapers and books, that's all they have. They've never gone and met someone who lived in Europe or came from Paris or came from Australia. They may never have seen these people, so they would be leery and afraid, and I think that's where a lot of these kind of customs probably come from, especially in this case, where some of the locals would know some of the customs and the legends, but there's always going to be that God-fearing person or people that just, that weird woman who lives in the swamp, she's obviously hexing everybody who has something bad happen. It must be that horrible voodoo queen that lives in the swamp.
I think she was smart enough to know that if she actually meant something like that, that it just wouldn't harm the town and the people. It would harm her relatives, her family, and her property too. So unless she put a lot of energy into it, I don't think she would seriously do that unless she had a very, very good reason. I can't see a good reason for harming people because...
No, just to do it.
Just to do it. There is no good reason for that.
Exactly.
But if she was, I think she would have done more than just sat in her porch and sang a song. I think that just the people who overheard it were scared because who knows why they were scared. Maybe they treated her like garbage.
It's possible.
Maybe, maybe they were rude to her. Maybe they think, oh no, maybe in some ways they felt they deserved it because who knows how people were treated back then. I mean, we just finished talking about that, but it's sad about what happened on her funeral, that everything seemed floated. That must have been one heck of a wet storm.
Can you imagine if everyone flees your
funeral
running?
and then the casket's not found, but your corpse is found, and it's
no. They found everything but the casket.
Oh, they found everything but. Oh, yeah, okay.
Everything but.
Right.
So they have no idea where she went.
That's horrible.
She's definitely in the swamp, I'm sure.
And I'm not surprised if her spirit still wanders because there was no closure.
Well, if you wander through the swamp and you hear her cackling, I guess that's supposed to be Julia Brown cackling.
It would be an interesting place to visit and do and record some activity there.
I've been to the swamp a few times in New Orleans and outside. There's not a lot of places to do leisure in the swamp.
I believe it. Well, and I can imagine it's not a safe place to hang around, really.
Yeah, I've been there at night and during the day. I liked it during the day better because you could see more.
Yeah, you sent me pictures of cats.
Oh yeah, there was a local cat that lived at the shack that rented the boats.
Yeah.
I think it was a cute cat. It was just laying
around.
He
was cute. Yeah.
But then I went and I was going to go pet an alligator sticking out on the side of the water next to the boats.
You were going to pet an alligator?
Well, I thought it was like a plaster alligator.
What did you want, your hand to be bitten off?
No, I thought it was a plaster fake alligator sitting on the shore by the boats for looks.
And Tony.
Jackie went, that's a real alligator. I go, no, that's not. That's fake. Look how dirty and old it is.
And you were going to take your chances and pet it.
I was getting close to it, and it moved. I'm like, oh my God, it's real. And then it jumped back into the water.
I am so glad she stopped you.
She didn't stop me. Thanks, Jackie. But, yeah, she did.
Well, she warned you at least.
Well, yeah, she says, that's a real one. I said, no, that's fake. It's totally fake. I'm going to show you it's fake. And then it really wasn't fake. It was too small. It was like as long as my leg, so it wasn't like it was huge.
Okay, why would they keep a fake alligator in a swamp?
Well, because it's tourism. We have boats on the shore.
It's not Disneyland.
Well, but it's still, they have like a vending machine. There's little farm animals you can look at. So I figured it has to be fake.
Gee, if you saw a snake wound around a tree, you know those big old snakes they have in swamps?
I probably would have thought it was fake.
Oh, it's a big snake. I'm going to go ahead and try to pet it.
Unless it moved, and then I'd be like, not so much.
I would have pulled you back and said, you stay right here.
But I'd want to get a nice picture of it.
From far away?
No, close up.
Of the snake?
Yes. I did take pictures of the alligator I tried to pet. I should show you one sometime.
That snake could have wound itself around you and...
Maybe.
Okay. Warn me, folks, before I take a boat ride with him in a swamp.
But they do have a night tour you can go on. It's kind of spooky. They take you through the swamp.
A night tour would be interesting.
But you can't see that much. It's so dark, you can't really see much. So to me, it was more fun to go at night or during the day.
During the day,
You can really see stuff. You can enjoy the day. You can see all the trees and the flowers. You can see the animals, which you can't see at night.
Oh, that would be cool.
So if you go during the day first, and if you want to go, if you go again, go to the night tour.
Now, apparently, the town where Julia lived, it's still there, and it's still out of the way.
Frenier?
Yeah, it's still there, and it's still out of the way. And apparently, it's more of a tourist spot now than it used to be, so it's not so isolated. I mean, it's still isolated, but not so much. The people can make their way there, and as they mentioned in the article. Now they have tours, and I guess she made the town famous. So,
Wow.
but
So they owe her now.
in my opinion, though, if her spirit wanders, it's because she never got closure. I mean, look what happened during her funeral.
Maybe. By that time, maybe she didn't care. Well, she didn't get closure. The people didn't get closure.
They didn't get closure, but...
I don't think the funeral is going to give closure to the person who died. I don't think they're going to care one way or the other, to be honest with you.
Okay.
They're free of their body, physical body. But the
True.
people who are lost to them, that's their way of getting closure. But if you had to flee because of a storm, that's not really closure.
Must have been an ugly storm. So.
If it killed 300 people and it was that devastating,
That's ugly.
Oh my God.
Yeah. I mean, that's sweeping people. That's sweeping everything away.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know the weather over there very well, but I imagine the storms there are pretty intense.
Just the wind, rainstorms that I've been in while I was there was devastating. The French Quarter flooded the last time I was there. They wouldn't let us go in the French Quarter. We had to stay on the outsides of the French Quarter because it was just no cab would go in the French Quarter, and nobody would drive in the French Quarter because it literally was, how many feet of water.
Now, it's true that the houses there don't have basements because of the storms there, and because the basements could become damp and flooded. Is that true?
Because they're below sea level.
Right.
So your basement would be the water in the water.
So they don't build basements.
No, not at all. They don't. A lot in the.
Yeah.
They don't build basements in a lot of some of the southern states. They don't for that reason.
Now, looking back on her records, she was born in the 1800s.
Mm-hmm.
And she was born before slavery became emancipated. And I know that Louisiana is a slave state, but she must have been born as a free person because they don't mention anything about her being born into slavery or her relatives.
It could have been because if she came straight to New Orleans, she may not have ever been involved in slavery. I mean, she would have seen. She maybe not would have. Sorry, let me rephrase that. She maybe would not have participated because she wasn't owned. But that doesn't mean, obviously, they had slave auctions in New Orleans in the French Quarter. They had obviously stuff going on, plantations all around New Orleans and on southern states. So if she came directly to New Orleans, it could be she was married to a man who was free.
Sure.
It could be...
but she had to have been free too, though, because it mentions her name and all these details about her, so it doesn't mention anything about her being connected with somebody else.
Exactly. We just don't have any information on her background.
Right.
Whether she was ever a slave, or did she come directly to New Orleans from Europe? Did she come to New Orleans from Haiti? Mm-hmm. It's hard to say where she came from.
Yeah.
There's just no information, so you can't really tell. But if she came from the slavery angle, then she might have had mother, grandmother, great-grandmother, could have all been slaves.
Could have been. But as you mentioned, there's no background.
Yeah.
I don't even think there's a portrait of her. I haven't seen one. I looked for it and I couldn't find it.
Yeah, she's even more... Well, it's funny because she came after Marie Laveau.
Yeah.
So you think there would be more information than Marie Laveau, right?
You would think there would be because...
But there's not.
There's not, no. So...
That's odd.
Interesting lady. Local healer. So, of course, she must have been loved by part of the community if she was able to heal. And so...
It's just the ones that, everything was wiped out. that were kind of leery of her, that just blamed everything on her anyway. Because it's so much easier to blame someone else.
Isn't that the way it's always been during history? When something happens...
Yeah, it still happens today.
Oh, yeah. It's like, oh, that person bewitched everybody, so...
We have someone, leader of our free country right now, who's blaming everybody for everything. It's always easier to blame someone else.
It's always easier to blame somebody, yeah. So it's a very cool story. I'd love to hear more about voodoo queens, more voodoo queens in Louisiana or other states.
Yeah, if you find any more, we'll do.
Oh yeah,
some more
because they all have such an interesting history. Because everybody who was involved as a voodoo queen or became famous as one has an interesting story behind them. Because they were. Because I know that they're voodoo queens now, modern ones and including some in California that they're kind of set apart from the regular community because they're learning an art that's been around for a couple hundred years, for a few hundred years now.
Yep.
Yeah.
Well, and some of them are. Some of the different voodoo queens, they have parables, similarities in their stories. Some of their background, it's funny how obviously voodoo woven its way into Christianity too, very strongly in Louisiana and New Orleans. So it's interesting when they say, "Oh, that devil voodoo stuff." Well, those voodoo people probably go to church more than you ever do.
It's true, and we've had a couple voodoo people on the show. We've had Charles Porter, and we've had Madame Pamita. She was wonderful.
Yep.
And I'd like a few more.
Just because you're involved in the art of voodoo culture and practice, hoodoo doesn't mean you're not a Christian, God-fearing soul too. So.
No, there's a lot of them that go to church and that pray to the saints and that pray to Jesus.
Yep.
Yeah, they pray and they go to church.
We are vast. Diverse people, folks. You can still be involved in voodoo and still have a strong religion.
Yeah.
Or voodoo.
Yeah, it's true.
There's people who are involved in not just voodoo, but voodoo.
Right. There's two different traditions, but
very different. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
That was good. That was interesting.
Yeah, great.
Another solo story for the voodoo set.
Yeah.
Okay, folks, and until next week, we will see you again. Bye.
See you next week. Bye.
Royalty-free, copyright-free music by Kevin MacLeod and Ross Bugden.